Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for preachers, teachers, and curious readers of the Hebrew Bible. I'm Rosy, Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible at Wake Forest University.
And I am Paul Esser. I'm a PhD student in Hebrew Bible at Yale University. We do not have our co-hosts Rachel Wren and Tim McNish here because they are off this week, but we are here. And Rosy, it's already first week of Lent.
I know. Can you believe it?
Yeah, time flies so fast. Yeah, but lucky you're kicking off the liturgical season of repentance on this day, March 9th, 2025. And it looks like our first reading is Deuteronomy 26, 1 through 11. So where's your mind right now?
Yeah, where is my mind? Like many preachers, probably when they saw Deuteronomy 26 as the first reading, probably panicked a little and thought, wow, what are we going to do with this reading?
Yeah.
But Paul, you started off by saying that we're entering the season of Lent, right? So
Yes.
that is a frame as we think about our readings for this week and as we think about this first reading, right?
Yep.
First week of Lent. And I also have to acknowledge, right, that within the kind of Christian prism of things, right, the gospel reading is a critical one to see within the frame of our readings. And our reading for the first week of Lent from the gospel is Luke's retelling of the temptation. So I'll
Yeah.
just put a little flag there for our listeners, right? That I know many of you will go straight to the gospel passage as you think about your preaching task this week. But let me
Yes.
ask you to just hold off for a moment and
That's right.
see if we can help our listeners appreciate the value of going through the first reading. And that is looking at Deuteronomy chapter 26, 1 through 11. And here the RCL is not cutting and pasting, but is giving us the full kind of liturgical reading of this section. And then we can connect possibly what we see here in Deuteronomy chapter 26 to our gospel reading and the season of Lent more broadly. Okay, how does that sound, listeners? How does that sound, Paul?
Sounds like a perfect plan. Let's go for it. Let's do it.
All right, so diving in, let's just remind our listeners of where we are. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, and broadly speaking, we are in the last book of the Pentateuch, right? The last book of the Torah. And by saying that, I'm also saying Deuteronomy contains what are considered the final instructions, the closing sermon of Moses, the last words of Moses, right? So Moses in Deuteronomy, broadly speaking, is facing his end, just sort of as we think about the literary character of Moses and his leadership. Deuteronomy chapter 26 falls toward the end of these final sermons as he charges the people, now a people who have emerged within the wilderness, right? Because the first generation that has left during the Exodus has died away in the wilderness. So this is a new generation that Moses is addressing and charging them to keep the entire covenant. When we get to Deuteronomy chapter 26, we are at the end of what is called by biblical scholars the book of the law. So chapters 12 to 26 are a section of legal code that kind of fits
Mhm.
within the middle of Deuteronomy. And chapter 26 describes a first fruits ceremony. And what is
Yeah.
that, right? So verses 1 through 11 describe a liturgy within Deuteronomy that is specifically directed at farmers in the land who are directed to bring some of their first fruits to the temple. And then it
Mhm.
gives them some words to say during the ceremony, right? The ceremony begins, very importantly, by acknowledging that God is the source of the farmer's harvest and that God is therefore the true owner of the food that is coming from the field. And very specifically, right, the chapter begins, you're to put some of the first of every fruit of the soil. So everything that you've grown, you put a little bit of that into a basket. And there's no date prescribed for this. So the intention is that this is kind of a rolling offering that the farmer is offering. So you
That's right.
present that basket of first fruits to the priest. You acknowledge God is the source. You literally say, God has given this to me. The priest then takes it from your hand, puts it in
Mhm.
front of the altar, and you say these words. You say, my father was a wandering Aramean. And from
Yeah.
there, you get a brief summary then of Israel's journey and its history, its suffering in Egypt, its miraculous rescue. It's a creedal formula. So a
Yeah.
rehearsal that the farmer is making that then kind of leads to this final set of words, into this land flowing with milk and honey, from which I bring these first fruits, which you, O Lord, have given me.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's the
Mm.
kind of liturgical reenactment. If you can picture it in your head too, it's not so far off from what we do in our church services, right? Liturgically,
Right.
there's the moment of the offering, right? And
Mhm.
it's brought up to the altar. It is
Mhm.
offered to the Lord. There is often a song or some words that are done in receipt, right? So there's an ebb and flow that we're picturing here, but here in Deuteronomy 26, we're getting a formal ceremony for a layperson. How does a layperson bring up an offering?
That's right.
And another thing that I wanna kinda bring up too is to notice the you and me language here, right? So that it is a pretty personal ceremony, right? So the farmer is saying, I bring this to you, O Lord," right? So the
S
idea here is that this is a personal connection, right? I'm a
Yeah.
farmer and I've grown these things, but I acknowledge that you, Lord, are the source. And
Oh,
it's meant to
dear.
reenact and acknowledge that God is ultimately the owner of all of these farmers' efforts, right? And one thing that I noticed that I think is worth kind of bringing up for preachers that might be looking at this text, perhaps even for the first time, is that the last verse of this reading, verse 11, is a command to enjoy, to be
Yeah.
happy, in all of these good, these tov, these things that have been given to you, these good things have been given to you. And you're not to enjoy that just by yourself. You bring it to the priest, you take the
Yeah.
basket, you bring it, you eat it together with the Levi who
Yeah.
doesn't have land, right? And the ger, so the stranger, the sojourner, the resident alien that's in your midst, that is the one with whom you share the first fruits, right? And that's the kind of beautiful liturgical ceremony here in Deuteronomy 26.
Yeah. I am struck by the plenty agricultural motifs in this liturgical moment within a liturgical moment we are celebrating right now. But I'm also like struck by the way you beautifully tell the story, how this moment of um appreciation, I would say, like an honoring of the very first fruits that they gain from farming on this new land that they are acquired is sort of honored and celebrated in a very formal, well organized ritual way, right? As a way of
Is
sort of remembering where they have been, um, but also where they are right now, and thinking about God's place in the midst of that journey. And you, I think you also did point to this too, which is like the reenactment of their history and their journey is part of the honoring, right, of the whole thing. And I think that says a lot about, like, maybe gratitude, but also more for me, I think it's like remembrance, right?
mm,
And thinking about where we've been, where our parents have been, and where we are right now, and using proceeds and seeds and harvest from the very land as like embodied objects of nailing down the memory of where we've been and the journey that we have experienced in a ritual way as we celebrate. I love that.
I'm so glad you're mentioning too the materiality of this
Yeah.
ceremony, right? Because I think the visual of people processing with baskets filled with harvest, like you can think of the smell of that, the joy of that, the colors of fresh fruits, of vegetables, of grains, like of all those things coming from the earth. It is a joyful moment. And I think,
Yeah.
as you've said, the material kind of blessings of the earth as you're invited to meditate on that, then connects us to this spiritual reality that
Yes.
undergirds it all, right? So this is a really beautiful circle that we see enacted every week within churches and within synagogues as well as the offering is taken. The
Yeah.
invitation is that these material blessings lead us to spiritual meditation, right? On the
That's right.
reality of who we are and what we want to be in the world, right?
That's
And
right.
to that point,
Yeah.
Paul, I should have mentioned before we started that I was stumbling over the Hebrew in this text. And I told Paul, I've heard that my father was a wandering Aramean and just kind of accepted it reflexively.
Hmm.
I hadn't done a lot of translation work in this chapter. And as I was
Right.
translating in preparation for this episode, I really stumbled over. this translation, right? And so I'm going to try to highlight this, and Paul's going to speak into this with me. But here's what the actual Hebrew reads: "Arami aved avi," right? And so you can hear the alliteration there, right? The idea that Aramio Vedavi is something you're supposed to be thinking about, right? My
Mhm.
father, an Aramean, wandering perhaps,
Mhm.
but,
Mhm.
the problem here is that the translation is strange. So, Aleph, Beit, Dalet, usually in the Hebrew is a verb that means to die, to perish, and throughout
Yes.
Deuteronomy, we actually see this. It's often in the kind of cursing ideas that if you don't do this, then you'll die, you'll perish, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes in the Hebrew, it means to stray.
Mhm.
Um, and so I'm guessing that this is how we're getting the translation. So here we have a call active participle. That's why we're getting the ing at the end, the wandering. But wandering
Yes.
does seem strange to me. It to me the word reflects more this idea of perishing,
Mhm.
this idea of failing, of straying, a declaration of being at one's mortal end, and maybe at the end of one's resources, of being
Mhm.
nearly dead. And it struck me that this translation might be useful to preachers as they think about the season of Lent, in
Yeah.
which the season begins with, the marking of the ashes on your forehead, that you are from dust and to dust you will return.
Yeah.
And that perhaps these opening words of the layperson, of the farmer bringing their fruits, is a recognition that it's not just that my father was a wandering Aramean, right? Some maybe charming sense of, just wandered along
Yeah.
the roads, right? But something that is actually communicating the struggle to
Yeah.
survive,
Yeah.
the idea that my ancestors were dying, that they were straying, that
Yeah.
we remember their disobedience, that we remember stories of their failings, right? And that this is not just a declaration that's to be made one off, but to be
Yeah.
really meditated on. What does it mean to say that my ancestors were dying, were a
Yeah.
dying people? So
Hmm?
I don't know. I put that, I know, Paul, you have some ideas about this too, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at the footnote in the Hebrew, and guys, just spare us a moment here to get a little technical. If you look at the footnote in the Hebrew, there's a lot of conversation. There are about like I think 6 different things in there. 4 of them are different Greek translations and different Greek text debating over like which one is actually the variant and whatever that means. And then there's one in the Syriac and then one in the Targum, which is like an Aramaic text, right? And every one of them is offering a different range. And the range of meanings, I think it begins from like either being lost or cast away or perishing or left behind. I feel like perishing is right at the center of it. And I guess like this sort of this range among the debates that exist around this awkward way of expressing the Hebrew and translating the Hebrew gives us the chance to also like think very broadly about it. And that's one thing that gives me hope that the translation that you're sticking with, which is like either straying or perishing, perhaps perishing is even like a better translation, like you rightly said. It fits a lot more even with the context too, right? Think about the journey that they have gone on as a people, beginning
Mhm.
and think of all of the things that their fathers and their forefathers went through before they got to where they were. I think it is characteristic of the term, right? Perishing, right?
Right, and I wonder what pastors might make of this, opening statement, about
Yes.
our ancestors and what we can
Yeah.
say about our common idea that, all of our ancestors, the reason why they're ancestors is because they passed away, right?
Because they
And
died.
there's some
Yeah.
acknowledgement that, like, while our ancestors are with us, and that's often something, we say, but that we also acknowledge that their lives have ended in some way, right? And I am alive, and this is something that I'm bringing to God, right? But I acknowledge that I come from people who die. We are mortal. That is a defining characteristic of
Yeah.
what we are, right? And whereas in the ancient Near East, the iconography was always of baskets being carried to the king in tribute, right?
Yeah.
Here we have the people processing toward the temple in tribute toward an eternal king, right? Toward God, right? So the images are being shifted in some way, and the acknowledgement of where I come from is that I come from a people who stray. I
Yeah.
come from people who have not always gotten it right.
That's
Um,
right.
And so every year every time the harvest comes up, I have an opportunity once again to acknowledge from whom I come, in my deepest being. Like so
That's right. Yeah,
and I think that's got some connection to
it does.
Lent, right? And I also just kind of want to remind people that these verses 5 through 8 that begin with this idea of my father was a wandering Aramean are recited and interpreted as part of the Passover Seder within the Jewish community as well, right? So
Oh. Yeah.
so just kind of recognizing, this moment of time in Lent, these words are meaningful for many different people of faith as they think about what it means to declare who we are through the ways that we offer our material blessings, right?
That's awesome. That's awesome. Would you like to talk about the Aramean part also?
Oh, right, right, right. So I find the citation of a wandering Aramean to be very strange, right? So I was recently teaching my students and, you know, identifying for them Aram of Damascus, right? This kind of traditional enemy in the 9th century that begins to rise against Israel. So what it indicates, even to kind of say who my people are, this is the strange thing to claim because they
Yes.
are enemies of the Israelites, and,
Yeah.
it's either something that's really very, very old, so maybe predating the enemy association in the 9th century, which then also makes me think of why it's, so old and so, cherished in this way
Yes.
that it's being kind of meditated and spoken over each of the harvests as the people are offering them. So, I don't know what we do with that, but maybe there's some
Yeah.
larger, meditation to make about, like, where we come from, where and our kind of
Yeah.
the mystery of that on
Yeah.
some I do wanna make sure that we connect
Yeah.
to the gospel passage, right? So I did
Yeah.
promise at the beginning that, preachers, if you had gone immediately to the temptation passage in Luke chapter 4, I wouldn't blame you, but I wanna see if I can help make the first reading echo within what you might have already been thinking about for the temptation in Luke
Mhm.
chapter 4, right? So, as I said again, we're in the season of Lent, right? And the Gospels focus on the temptation of Christ directly after his time of preparation in the wilderness. In the Christian prism, this is the readings. This is what the readings are echoing through, right? So, year C, our liturgical year, of course, takes us through the Gospel of Luke. And so we have the Lucan temptation to help us enter into the season, right? So Jesus' temptation in Luke occurs after having spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting. Now,
Yes.
this is the number that determines the liturgical period of Lent as well, right? In imitation
Yes.
of Jesus.
Mhm.
And Jesus is following a pattern as well, a pattern that's been set in the Hebrew Bible, a pattern that's been
Yeah.
set by prophets like Moses and Elijah, who too prepared in the wilderness for the work ahead, right? And it's a symbolic period of 40 days and 40 nights. The church imitates this preparation by taking up these 40 days of self examination, of penitence,
Mhm.
and of preparation, right? So I say that as we think about this first fruits conversation that we've had. Now, the
Yeah.
first fruit ceremony, as Paul and I have both kind of been thinking about, it places a lot of emphasis on place, on the land, on
Yeah.
the yield of the earth, on the bread that they depend on for life. And it moves us from the natural world, from food, toward identity and our kind of true identity, our spiritual identity, right?
Yes.
I want to connect that to the temptation stories because in the first temptation for both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is coming out of the wilderness hungry after fasting for 40 days, right? So the temptation that he's offered at first is to turn stones into bread.
Yeah.
And that is to satisfy his own hunger with his own strength, right? So I think kind of maybe recognizing what the first fruits does as a liturgical practice, right? Is it's a
Yeah.
practice of turning over this food and saying, this is not from my power. It is not mine to own. It is mine
Yes.
to share. It is mine to acknowledge that I've received it as a gift, right?
Yeah.
Jesus, in refusing to turn the stones into bread, is is reflecting, I think, in some sense, the spirit of what the first fruit ceremony is also kind of inculcating within the people. When
Mhm.
Jesus responds, "Humans do not live on bread alone," there's a recognition there that there is more to our existence than survival. There's
That's right.
more to our existence than hustle. There's
Yeah.
more to our existence than the personal power that we're able to muster up to the task, right? We
Yes.
don't provide just for ourselves and our own, but the provisions that we've been given also to share, right? So
Yeah.
the liturgical ceremony ends in verse 11 with a sharing with the Levites, the priests, and a
Yeah.
sharing with those who do not own that land, who are
Yeah.
considered peers, right? So to me, I think Jesus is reminding us in that first temptation that our lives are more than about survival and striving. So too the first fruits liturgy, right? And
Man.
I think that
Mm.
practice of Lent is an opportunity to reinforce that lesson for us today as we take up these readings in our moment, where
Yeah.
appetites and cravings and self interest and self striving are very
Yes.
much a part of our culture and our world. The professional hustle is one that we all kind of, I don't know, we just kind of work in that world, right? But Jesus counteracts against that in this first temptation, right? Our
Yeah.
spirits need feeding. That's something
Yeah.
that reinforces, and recalibrating ourselves to recognize that this yearning exceeds any material satisfaction. No amount of likes on your social media are going to feed that yearning, right? So I don't know if preachers can maybe use something, in how I'm circling around these readings, but don't ignore the first fruits liturgy
Yeah.
for it is inculcating within the people, right? The other kind of thing I might say here also is that
Huh?
our looping temptation is different from our Matthew's temptation, right?
Mhm.
And the
Mhm.
order is different, right? So for scripture
Yes.
scholars, for those of you that remember this from seminary, the temptations are the order is changed, right? The first one is the same, but Luke's temptation ends not with the challenge to worship the devil and receive all the kingdoms of the world,
That's right.
but
Yeah.
instead Luke brings Jesus to the top of the temple, right? Leads him back to Jerusalem at the pinnacle of the mount, looking over the great city. And then the devil challenges him to throw himself down in anticipation of the psalmic promise that God will
Mm.
not allow him to come to harm. Now, if you notice, preachers, Psalm 91, our second reading, is the psalm from which the devil is quoting in the third temptation of Luke, right? So, in
Yeah.
that kind of the irony, or maybe just to let your congregations know, Satan loved the Psalms. So for my Psalm scholar, Rachel, just a little, hey, oh, Satan also knew his Psalms pretty well. So he quotes Psalm 91. But
Yes.
it's very poignant to me that Luke brings Jesus to the temple at the end, right? Because
Yes.
what we know of history is that the temple is destroyed in 70 CE, right?
Yeah.
And so, as Jesus is brought to this moment by the Lucan narrative, right, there is a poignancy here as we, the reader, know what will not only happen to this building, but what
Mhm.
Jesus seems to know will happen to his own body, right? So even though Satan's saying, jump from here, you won't be crushed, you won't die, Jesus knows that in fact he will, right? That his own body is being prepared to be crushed, to
Yeah.
be crucified, to be buried, to be broken, right? And so the irony here in these temptations, right, is also that that Jesus knows that even though the devil's telling him to jump, right, and that's the way to test God, he's also saying, I'm not going to test God this way. I
Yeah.
don't have to prove myself. And in fact, maybe Jesus knows exactly where this narrative's heading, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful the way you make connections between all of these passages and stories and the themes and the borderlines of things. I'm really struck by the way you thematize like desire and temptation and the way we are drawn into proving things and demonstrating things. I feel like there is certainly plenty of opportunities to preach this passage for sure. Like this is the first time I am making any solid, with your help, connections between the first fruit passage in Deuteronomy and then this passage in Luke, right?
What?
It worked brilliantly.
Okay.
Well, I think this will be a fantastic place to end it. So thank you so much for your heavy work on this passage and passages, I would say. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All right, friends, we hope that you certainly found something helpful in our discussion today. Remember that you can always find a backlog of plenty of episodes in about any passage that has ever shown up in the lectionary on our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. Make a donation if you are able, and help us keep the podcast going. And a big thank you to everyone who has already donated something to our podcast in the last year or even this year. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you get podcasts. And if you found any of this helpful, leave us a review, send us a comment, something encouraging, or say hi. Until next time when we meet again, my name is Paul Essa.
And I'm Rosy Cannibal, wishing you a fruitful lentil season.
Indeed, fruitful indeed.
Fruitful.